Coming to you live from Austin, Texas, this is People's Republic with Brianna Griffith. We bring you news and analysis from the global struggle for social and economic justice. I'm your host, Brianna Griffith, and here's what's going down in your backyard and across the world. All right, as coronavirus continues to threaten global healthcare systems and economies, no country has yet suffered as much of an initial shock as China. As the epicenter of the viral outbreak, China did not have the benefits of months of research into the virus or social and economic preparation that other countries did. When any other country experiences such a tragedy, especially European countries, it's met with international displays of solidarity. We are told not to politicize a tragedy. But when China experiences an epidemic or disaster, the conversation in U.S. media turns immediately toward victim blaming. Corporate media and government officials have used the deaths of thousands of Chinese people as a chance to take cheap and unfounded potshots at Chinese culture and political leadership. Now, here's where the U.S. media response borders on what a cynic might call journalistic malpractice. The U.S. media had 2 months advance notice between the initial revelation of COVID-19 and the initial outbreak. But instead of using this time to inform their own citizens about the potential dangers of COVID, the right-wing media racialized the virus, while the center establishment media, the so-called center establishment, threw every possible accusation at the Chinese government. Now, Western governments are scrambling to learn what worked in China after ignoring their proactive measures, while civilians in Western countries are struggling to find accurate sources of information. Now, I want to start with a few late January headlines and tweets from public figures so we can understand the U.S. media's what I would consider negligence in this role. So on January 27th from the Washington Post, they brought you the article, China's Coronavirus Lockdown, brought to you by authoritarianism. On January 25th, The Atlantic tweeted, amid concerns about the new respiratory virus, some 35 million people in China are not allowed to leave their communities. Is this ethical? And then Slate on 25th of January said that China has effectively quarantined 35 million people. That's alarming. And then Kenneth Roth, in a Human Rights Watch tweet on 25th of January, said, in typical Chinese Communist Party fashion, Beijing confines 35 million people rather than pursuing the transparent and targeted approach to the Wuhan coronavirus that public health and human rights require. 2 months from these headlines and tweets and authoritarianism, fear-mongering, the Chinese approach to containment has been hailed as a new step forward in public health policy by the World Health Organization. Meanwhile, U.S. cities are reluctantly being forced to adopt these exact same quarantine policies that made China so-called authoritarian after a complete failure of federal and, in most cases, state leadership. But facts and results have mattered little to the corporate media narrative around public health. The net propaganda goal was to show that China could do nothing right. If the Chinese government attempted to enact a quarantine, this was evidence of unacceptable authoritarianism. If China didn't enforce a quarantine, then they were accused of not taking the virus seriously. If China tried to prevent the spread of misinformation, such as the unfounded claim that SARS was back, a totally different virus, this was supposedly because they were hiding the truth from their people and trying to ignore the disaster. But if China published information about the disease, they were accused of using fear-mongering to control their population. If the disease was successfully contained, then the U.S. media could accuse China of stamping out civil liberties. But if the disease was not contained, then China could be blamed for stifling information and not doing enough to prevent the spread of disease. U.S. officials at the highest levels of government have even trotted out the completely unsubstantiated conspiracy theory that China itself unleashed the virus to quell protests. China was somehow, in this scenario, both too authoritarian and not authoritarian enough at the same time, because the U.S. media was slinging everything at the wall to see what would stick. Well, what stuck in the corporate media-approved conspiracy theory rumor mill was the case of Li Wenliang. In corporate media, Li was described by the New York Times as a whistleblower who tried to warn the public about the virus, but was arrested by the authorities before he tragically contracted the virus and died. A classic David and Goliath, little guy versus authoritarian communist story setup. The problem, though, was that every detail of this story was verifiably false. Let's look at the facts. Li Wenliang was an ophthalmologist, not an epidemiologist, virologist, infectious disease specialist, or anything else that was relevant to the study of viruses. That is, he was an eye doctor. The hospital in which he worked was already taking precautions against the virus, including isolation with suspected patients. On December 30th, days after the hospital had been notified and investigations had begun, Li shared his speculation that SARS was back. Now, he didn't claim it was a SARS-like epidemic, as the New York Times basically claimed he said. He claimed it was SARS itself. In that same chat, he also shared confidential patient information. He also didn't attempt to notify any authorities or the public, but he shared this speculation in a private chat with a handful of his colleagues. This is not what whistleblowing is. Finally, Li was never arrested. He was called in, lightly reprimanded, and went straight back to work. By the time of this reprimanding on January 3rd, the Chinese government had already widely released far more accurate information about the virus. So just to be clear, instead of providing vital information on the virus for the months preceding its international outbreak, the U.S. media used the COVID virus to engage in racist, fear-mongering, and victim-blaming. Now it is clear that China's experience with COVID and ability to mobilize vast resources for public health is the necessary step forward to saving millions of lives. But it is the U.S. ruling establishment, not China, that has suppressed this information due to its own greed and vanity. Now, to talk more about China, COVID-19, and public health, we are joined now by KJ No. KJ is a peace activist and scholar on the geopolitics of the Asian continent, who writes for Counterpunch and Dissident Voice. He is special correspondent for KPFA Flashpoints on the pivot to Asia, the Koreas, and the Pacific. And he's recently authored the article, Yellow Caking an Epidemic, New York Times Spreads the Virus of Hatred Again. Thank you, KJ, for coming on the show.
Thank you, Brianna.
I'm very glad to have you on. So I'm wondering if you can just get into sort of the meat of this article. When we're talking about yellow caking tragedy, some people may have forgotten what exactly the kind of yellow cake scandal was all about, and sort of the people may be vaguely familiar with the build up to the Iraq War and sort of the misinformation around there. But I mean, what really, with regard to the way the U.S. media was handling this China thing, what really inspired you to kind of drill into this and look at the kind of facts on the ground?
Well, the first point is that I use the term yellow cake very deliberately. It's both a pun, if you will, but it's also a direct reference to what the New York Times did regarding the Iraq War. Remember, there were these allegations of weapons of mass destruction, and these involved aluminum pipes, and then also, the procurement of yellow cake, which is the precursor for uranium that Joseph Wilson was later able to debunk. But all this is to say that we have never managed to get rid of this lie. It's such a persistent lie that even after invading Iraq under false pretenses, there are still people to this day who believe that Iraq had weapons of mass destruction or their precursors or some such similar capacity. So this is the problem, is that once you put out a lie like this, then it never seems to go away. And the New York Times is responsible for this particular lie regarding COVID-19. And this is the lie that is being weaponized by the White House and the State Department in order to deflect blame away from this terrible catastrophe that is unfolding before our eyes right now.
Yeah, I think what you said, sort of like essentially about the way the New York Times has handled this, and once it gets put out there, it's kind of out there forever. I think around China, the standard for reporting just generally has dropped to near zero as China has become essentially a power on the world stage. The corporate media has basically dropped its sort of journalistic practices to absolute nothing. And I feel like in many times we wind up having, I think, the same conversations with people over and over and over again. Those of us in the anti-war movement, those of us who see that this is in a sense, this is a part of a larger demonization campaign that in many ways is completely fact-free or relies entirely on sort of U.S. state-backed sources such as either the CIA, the National Endowment for Democracy, and other of these essentially like soft power outlets that are then getting like thrust back upon us. Those of us who see these larger patterns are always struggling, I think, with the sheer volume of information, or I guess you could call it misinformation or disinformation, about what's going on in China. This particular case of the so-called whistleblower, I think, is very instructive, and I'm glad that you wrote that. Again, I want to encourage people to go to actually read this article. It's available in several different places, but it's once again called "How to Yellowcake a Tragedy." Yeah, I think the sheer volume, as we were talking about, of different like sort of information or factoids or whatnot, it is overwhelming to a lot of people. But ultimately, when you drill down to it, like, what is this sudden concern, I think, by the New York Times for whistleblowers when they have no such respect for people who have actually blown the whistle on sort of real kind of powerful operations within the United States? There's no whistleblowing, I think, here at all if you're just sending a message within a private chat. I'm wondering if you can expand on any of those ideas.
Yes, absolutely. So coming back to the whistleblowing, you're absolutely right. You don't see the New York Times talking about Julian Assange or John Kiriakou or any of a number of people who are real whistleblowers who are being crucified or have been crucified. That's completely different. So immediately, if you see the term whistleblower or this kind of valorization in the mainstream media, especially in the New York Times, then you have to think very critically about it. Again, coming back to this idea, as you pointed out, he was not a whistleblower. He made the wrong claim because he claimed that it was confirmed as coronavirus. There was no evidence of human-to-human transmission at the time, and there'd been no fatalities at the time. So it's understandable why the Chinese government might have been a little bit hesitant to shut down their entire country on the basis of some very, unusual but not very serious seeming flu-like symptoms, pneumonia-type symptoms at the time. I think what we need to look at is essentially this trope that comes out of this whistleblower mythology, which is that the Chinese covered up a catastrophe, and in doing so, they created a Chernobyl for themselves. This was referred to as a communist coronavirus, or the Chinese Chernobyl. And it was created because the Chinese were not transparent and they sought only to cover up embarrassments rather than to deal with things in a realistic and scientific manner. That's actually exactly the opposite. They did deal with it in a very objective manner. They had their fingers, if you will, on the pulse of the epidemic. They had a hair trigger system that they, initiated very, very quickly. And very quickly they moved into some very, very effective containment and screening and contact tracing measures, which is what you would do if you had an epidemic. They were doing classical public health, and they did it extraordinarily well, and they did it using all the capacities of their technology and their science and their will, and really their care and their compassion for for their people.
Oh, go ahead.
Yes. But all of this was disregarded, and so by doing this China bashing, the U.S. Made a huge mistake. The Chinese were effectively broadcasting information not just about the disease, its risk, and its scope, but they were also giving out tremendous amounts of very, very important information on how to deal with it. And all of that was disregarded because of this ideological hubris, this belief that this is communist, it's a communist coronavirus, it can't happen here. And also anything that the Chinese did, as you point out, all of these things are necessary and essential public health strategies. These were all tarred and exaggerated and mischaracterized as authoritarian abuse. And now we're at this point where all the countries are doing pretty much the same thing. Right now, as we speak, in the San Francisco Bay Area, we are under a lockdown, as is, many, many states right now.
And essentially the states that have failed to do that, such as Texas, have essentially thrown the burden of maintaining public health, the burden of saving lives, essentially onto these municipal governments. Right now, essentially every Texas city is fending for itself in a lot of ways, in terms of in terms of their responses to this whole thing. Like essentially they're like forced to sort of make their own decisions. It's haphazard. A lot of the decision making is just being made entirely at this local level, as opposed to like this Chinese response, which is called authoritarianism, but essentially is absolutely necessary in order to actually save lives in this case. What is there authoritarian about saving lives?
Exactly. I mean, the point is that if you value lives, and if you think that the right to life is an important one, then you sometimes have to take measures in order to preserve life, and to adhere to some kind of impossible standard of negative rights, of freedom from interference all the time, while watching, while facing imminent catastrophe, imminent loss of human life. That is something that doesn't make any sense. You cannot exercise your rights if you do not have a life to exercise it with. First, we save lives, and then we think about the other things. And that's one of the differences between the Chinese approach and this head in the sand American approach, which, as you point out, is throwing things back down to the individual and the local level. This is not how you defeat a global pandemic. You do need a whole of society, whole of government approach. It's not to say that that approach can't be differentiated. In fact, it has to be. It has to be targeted to the context and the locality. And you apply it in a very intelligent way, like the Chinese did. First, you screen everybody, but you screen them for fever because that's the easiest thing to screen for. You have infrared scanners, you screen people very, very rapidly. And if people show a fever, then you take them to a fever clinic where they receive some very, very simple tests, including a flu test to see if they don't have a flu, in which case that would imply that they do not have the coronavirus. If they do have, if they test negative for the flu, but they show up a series of other symptoms, then you do a CT scan. You scan their lungs to see if there's the ground glass pattern, which is typical of the coronavirus. If they show the ground glass pattern, then you put them into isolation. You do not release them back to their homes, tell them to stay with their families, because they will infect their families. You put them into a separate building or a hotel. You keep them there, you take good care of them, you feed them, you give them activities, and you monitor them carefully until they're healed. And if they are not healed, or if they are aggravated, then you give them every possible medical treatment possible. This includes oxygen, this includes ventilators, this includes ECMO, extracorporeal membrane oxygenation, and a whole host of other medical supports. But you do what is necessary, and you do all of this for free. And you also make it possible for people not to go to work by either paying them not to go to work, and that was the case for at least 1/3 of the population, or you suspend the payment of rents and the payment of credit and the payment of mortgages, so that people can actually relax and take care of themselves and heal. And then you come back to, reconstructing, your businesses when people are healed and when society is safe. If you don't do this, and you do this on a piecemeal fashion, then what happens is that the system falls apart. It becomes like a sieve. People will escape from one jurisdiction to another. They'll go to jurisdictions where they can do what they want to. The disease will spread from one place to another. And this is actually what we're seeing right now. Right now, it looks like the United States is going to be the largest center of pandemic growth. And as we stand right now, the mortality rate, the fatality is about 500. There are about 50,000 cases that have been recorded and about 500 mortalities. But we also know that this mortality rate will double every 2 days based on current projections, which means that today it's 500. On Thursday, it will be 1,000. On Saturday, it will be 2,000. On Monday, it will be 4,000. On Wednesday, it will be 8,000, and so on and so on. Geometric progression. This is the catastrophe we're facing. And if you ask the doctors in the emergency wards, they are all telling you it's like we're watching a tsunami gather in the distance, and we have nothing prepared to deal with it.
And essentially what's necessary is, as we're talking about this centralized planning of some sort of society, the very idea of centralized planning is so demonized, so stigmatized, that it essentially can't be talked about within U.S. media. Like the particular actions of the executive branch might be lauded or might be criticized, but generally this idea that all of society needs to be planned in a different way around something like public health is just not, I think, even talked about. And it's really it's taxing absolutely to the max the U.S. healthcare system in a way that it's not taxing China's healthcare system or other socialist healthcare systems when they are taxed to the max like this, when they are presented with, these sort of challenges. Usually the challenges are trying to break through U.S. Sanctions measures. So, for instance, the U.S. in recent years has prevented life-saving medicine such as insulin from reaching Venezuela or from reaching, Cuba is another country that's been infamously sanctioned, and Iran is one of the hardest hit countries in the world. The U.S. continues this maximum pressure campaign. But essentially, besides the sanctions effects, the effects the sanctions are having on the rest of the world, what we're seeing here, though, is an absolute taxing of the U.S. healthcare system and an abdication, I think, complete abdication of responsibility for public health to the so-called free market, to the private sector that's unable to deal with any of this. The U.S. government has measures in place that can, during wartime or whatnot, that it can mobilize, certain factories or whatnot in order to do what's necessary to produce for the public good. China essentially did that. China, from my understanding, was able to, take these different factories, take factories that would have been producing weapons or whatnot, and instead put them toward producing the necessary medical equipment. And yet we're not seeing the same thing in the U.S. So essentially, now as part of this propaganda campaign, as China, which has successfully recovered to some degree or has essentially gotten its own coronavirus under control, it is producing these medical supplies, these desperately needed medical supplies for other parts of the world. And the U.S. media is now saying, well, this is a propaganda campaign. This is China is buying influence or whatnot. Well, I mean, no, this is an absolute necessity. This is saving millions of lives. And I think simple reality here is that whatever issues people might, whatever criticisms people might have of China, the reality is simply that the Chinese system here works. The Chinese social, economic, and political system, it worked to save lives, and it is now saving lives across the world, while the U.S., for instance, the lieutenant governor here is basically telling older people, senior citizens, that they should die for the salvation of the economy. It's absurd. I mean, it shows really, I think, to me, which is the humanitarian system for the vast majority of people.
I think that's absolutely right. And it follows that if you have a system that values profits over people, you're going to get a certain set of outcomes. You're going to get a certain set of societal and business structures. And on the other hand, if you believe in rationalized, centralized planning for the future, for the common good that is responsive to people's needs, then you are going to get a different set of priorities, different set of structures. And when necessity arises, there's also the capacity to turn around very quickly and to produce what's necessary. For example, the Chinese in the beginning, they had some gaps, but they were able to ramp up very quickly. Within weeks, they were making 100 million masks a day. They built a hospital within 10 days. They, created 14 hospitals inside of Wuhan itself. So this kind of incredible agility and this incredible rapidity and responsiveness is something that you get when you have a rational, centralized planning, a rationalized, centralized organization, which is led on scientific principles. And I focus on the science. The Chinese leadership, almost to a person, they are either scientists or engineers. Whereas in the United States, most of the leadership is lawyers, ambitious lawyers, or ambitious business people. And because of that, you get a completely different worldview. And unfortunately, you get this kind of magical thinking and irrationality and superstition that ends up with people suffering and people and human lives being ignored.
And I think to some degree
yes.
I think to some degree there's also the hubris that essentially the U.S. corporate media and to I think a lesser degree the sort of ruling establishment within kind of the U.S. state has begun to a large degree believe their own lies, that it's actually the socialist states that are unstable, when in fact it seems to be the United States that is extremely unstable at the moment. If anyone would like to ask questions, please comment in the chat. And we will be glad to take questions. We are once again speaking with KJ No, who is a peace activist who often writes for Counterpunch, among other outlets, and a special correspondent for KPFA Flashpoints on the pivot to Asia, the Koreas, and the Pacific. So I'd also like to get into sort of the geopolitical, more general issue of why the U.S. and the U.S. media is so essentially obsessed with China. I think to a large degree, in the same way that the U.S. media was trying to portray Trump as a Russian stooge. There's now this kind of mental gymnastics going on to show that he's somehow, that somehow China has got his ear when in fact he's as hostile to China as he can possibly be. Why is generally the U.S. media so obsessed with China? What is the geopolitical aim here?
So for that we have to dial back a little bit, look at the history. But after the fall of the Soviet Union, there was a document that was leaked in 1992. This was called the Defense Planning Guidance Document, and we think the author was Paul Wolfowitz. But what this document said was that the United States should never allow another peer competitor to challenge it the way that the Soviet Union had, that it should be the sole global hegemon, and it should never tolerate challenge or competition. And to that end, it should apply all means necessary, including what was referred to as a full spectrum domination. This document, the Defense Planning Guidance Document, in 1995 became the basis of what we now know as the Project for the New American Century. And essentially, again, that was the understanding that we have to curtail the rise of a peer competitor. And these people also deeply infused with what Halford Mackinder called the theory of the pivot state, which is that there is the Eurasian continent will be the center of global power, and that countries that rely on naval power will eventually recede, so that they who control the pivot state control the world. The pivot state would essentially be China and Russia. This is one of the kind of key doctrines in geopolitics. Well, in 2011, these two ideas come together in what's called the pivot to Asia. This is Barack Obama / Hillary Clinton's doctrine that they need to contain China, surround it with bases, move 60% of U.S. military and armaments to Asia, and prevent China from challenging the United States in any domain. What we started to see there was first not only the amping up of the information warfare, the demonization, the propaganda against China, but what we now can see is hybrid warfare, which is to say that it's not quite kinetic warfare. We haven't reached the point of lobbing missiles and bombs yet, although those are very, very much in the wings and ready to be deployed in a moment's notice. But we see all the other forms of warfare. So, of course, information warfare, cultural warfare, economic warfare, technological warfare, for example, the attacks on Huawei, and then also lawfare or legal warfare. For example, the South China Sea Tribunal was a form of legal warfare to delegitimate China. And currently, as we speak, in U.S. Congress, there are 112 bills that are targeting China right now.
112. Is that
Yes.
new? Is that an uptake? Like that's an incredible amount.
Well, there are actually 113, and one of them is kind of tokenistic. It's one of those bills that is symbolic. But the other 112 have teeth in them, and every single one of them is about attacking and containing and challenging China in some way. This is, it's unprecedented in U.S. history.
One of the things that I absolutely consider, I think, a necessity on the geopolitical stage is for, at this point at least, is for there to be essentially a multipolarity of some sort. So we saw what the U.S. unipolar world order looked like in the early 90s through, I'd say, the kind of mid-2000s, through essentially the War on Terror, where essentially there was a single global political pole that was sort of the global hegemon, and that was the United States. That was essentially that gets portrayed in many ways, and even kind of post World War II, the capitalist world order under the United States and post World War II is kind of described in this way of like the U.S. being the world police in such nostalgic terms, when in reality this kind of Pax Americana, I guess if you would want to use that term, this U.S. unipolar world order was a time of horrific warfare and regime change and essentially unchecked U.S.-backed genocide all across the world through the dictatorships they were supporting in Latin America, in the Middle East. It goes on and on. And so on the world stage, with the rise, I think, of China, of other kind of stronger independent states, even if they're not socialist states, such as Russia and Iran, to some degree Venezuela, of these essentially these independent or semi-independent states that can provide some level of challenge to the U.S. world order. I think we're seeing actually a kind of renewed a sort of renewed peace, because the U.S. no longer feels like it can destabilize anywhere on the planet that they want in the way they could up until maybe the attempt to overthrow the Syrian government was sort of the point at which like the U.S. regime change operations stalled out. And the multipolarity aspect was absolutely key there. The idea that there are powers that can keep United States dominance in check, even if these are not perfect countries. Obviously, there's no such thing as a perfect country. Even if these countries contain within them their own social contradictions that they need to work out, this multipolarity, I think, is an absolute necessity at this kind of stage for the development, I think, of progressive movements that aren't simply going to be crushed when the U.S. can essentially play whack-a-mole with anyone challenging its power. Do you sort of agree with that assessment, or is there anything you'd like to sort of push back on there, or other just general thoughts?
Well, I think you're absolutely right. I mean, anytime you have a monoculture, you are rarely going to have good results. If you have a political monoculture that is characterized by the massive exercise of violence and power, literally, a reign of terror. This era of Pax Americana was really a reign of terror and genocide, as you point out. Then, of course, that cannot have good results anywhere. And more than that, what it did was it destroyed the capacity of alternate systems to arise and evolve. All of these different possibilities, this non-violent, non-capitalist, non-exploitative, egalitarian, cooperative ideologies were all snuffed out in the crib during this period. And so the fact that this has been somewhat attenuated and that it cannot have its way, the Leviathan cannot have its way all the time in all things. This is a good thing because it creates space, it creates these interstices where different possibilities, different political systems, different more humane societies can arise. And to that extent, this is, a very optimistic development. The problem is, and this comes back to the hubris that you mentioned, is that countries that pose a challenge to this late capitalist, imperialist hegemon are considered to be existential threats. They're not, but they're considered to be ideologically existential threats to the U.S. system, and therefore the U.S. is engaging with all means, every means possible to obliterate them. And that's why China is so avidly and so desperately targeted, because it actually does create a different center of gravity through which different systems and a different kind of coexistence can arise. What the Chinese are working on right now is what they call the Belt and Road Initiative, or the One Belt, One Road initiative. And this is essentially a kind of rekindling of the old Silk Road, when China was, a large global hegemon, but it coexisted in peace with all of its neighbors and brought all of them up through trade and through cultural exchange. This was, kind of a Renaissance period. This is what the Chinese are trying to recreate. It's a win-win system. It's not a zero-sum game, but a win-win system where countries help each other develop, which China is doing with many third world countries. It works extensively on poverty eradication based on the lessons that China has learned, getting rid of poverty, bringing 850 million people out of poverty. It's sharing those lessons across the world and then trying to look for ways where there can be amicable and cooperative ways of developing together. All of this, this non-imperialistic way of approaching the world is considered a threat by the imperial center and the former imperial powers. And that, again, is the reason why there's so much vehement propaganda against China right now.
I think that's an absolutely kind of great place to wrap up on. We have, I guess we have all the time in the world since we're live streaming, but we have, I guess, time really for kind of one or two more sort of general thoughts. If there's anything you feel like still needs to be sort of discussed or elucidated, any sort of kind of last thoughts, either on sort of the outbreak of COVID, the Chinese response, or just the general geopolitical developments, or the sort of, I think, economic contradictions within the United States that this has revealed as well.
Well, I think we've learned several things. One is that if we want to deal with this coronavirus has been very illuminating because it has showed us the gaps in this system, in the U.S. system. It's fundamentally an indictment of capitalism and neoliberalism. If you want to have a society that is viable and livable, then you need to think about socialism or socialist measures. This includes having single-payer healthcare, a national insurance program. It includes having sick leave and paid time off. It includes not allowing the medical infrastructure to get away, or any industry to get away with valorizing profits over human beings. So these are just some fundamental shifts that have to take place. But I think this is a good opportunity for us to start to really think critically about that. And on that note of thinking critically, the other thing that we have to watch out for is, as the situation becomes more and more heightened, as the tragedies become amplified, you will see a heightening of the rhetoric and the propaganda. It's almost as if what William Casey, the head of the CIA, said in 1981 to Ronald Reagan. He said, "We'll know that our work is done when everything people believe is a lie." That project right now is coming into complete fruition. So we have to exercise tremendous critical thinking, evaluate very, very carefully the propaganda, the lies that are coming out of the mainstream media, and to really watch carefully, to think critically. And again, your show, by having the kind of speakers and bringing the critical scrutiny to the mainstream media, I think is serving a very, very invaluable function. And I thank you for having me on.
Oh, yeah. The pleasure is very much all mine, and thank you very much for doing the level of journalism you do. This was a very insightful article. Once again, as we wrap up, I want to just mention we were joined by KJ No. KJ is a peace activist and scholar on the geopolitics of the Asian continent, who writes for Counterpunch and Dissident Voice. He is a special correspondent for KPFA Flashpoints on the pivot to Asia, the Koreas, and the Pacific. He has recently authored the article that we talked about today, which is Yellow Caking an Epidemic. New York Times spreads the virus of hatred. Again, we will link in the video to this article. Thank you very much, KJ, for coming on the show today.
Thank you, Brianna.
All right, so yeah, you are watching People's Republic, that's all we have for now. You have been watching People's Republic. People's Republic originates in Austin, Texas, and is available as a podcast on Spreaker, Stitcher, iTunes, or wherever podcasts are podded. Thanks for watching as we bring you the latest news from the global struggle for social and economic justice. We are out of here, and tune in next time we do this. We're going to be doing this throughout the COVID epidemic. We will catch you soon.